The sky above Sector 9 was dark and cold with thick gray clouds covering the stars like a heavy blanket, and the air was filled with tension as the people of the Terran Republic waited for news from the front lines. But all they got was silence, and more silence. And that silence was louder than any explosion could ever be. Johnny had been the best strategist the Republic ever had, and his mind was sharp and fast like lightning. And he always stayed one step ahead of everyone else, even his own team sometimes. And now he was gone without a word or warning, just disappeared as if the ground had opened and swallowed him whole. And that made people afraid more than any alien threat ever could. Some believed he had betrayed the Republic and joined the enemy, and some thought he had gone mad from the pressure of too many battles and too many lives lost, and others whispered that he was still fighting in the shadows, doing something big and dangerous and secret. And no one knew the truth, not even Maria. Maria had been his partner for 2 years, and together they had stopped invasions, cracked codes, and escaped death more times than she could count, and she trusted him more than anyone in the galaxy. But now she sat alone in the cold metal war room, staring at the empty chair where Johnny used to sit, and all she could feel was confusion and anger and fear all mixed together like a storm in her chest. The alien fleet was getting closer every hour, and their warships were larger than mountains and full of deadly weapons and terrible machines that could burn cities to the ground in seconds, and the Terran Council was panicking, holding emergency meetings and shouting orders and blaming each other while the people prayed for a miracle that was not coming. Maria could not sleep that night, and she walked through the halls of the base, trying to make sense of everything, and her boots echoed on the floor with each step like a ticking clock counting down to something terrible. And she ended up outside Johnny's quarters, which had been locked since his disappearance, and she stood there for a long time before finally taking out her override chip and opening the door. Inside the room, it was quiet and still, and everything was just as he had left it, with a half-finished game of chess on the table and a cup of cold coffee by the bed and papers and maps scattered across the desk. And Maria walked slowly, looking at the familiar mess, hoping for a sign or clue, anything that would tell her what really happened to him. She found it hidden beneath a pile of data pads, a small black chip marked with the number 9, which was their old mission code. And she knew right away that it was from Johnny, because he always left messages like that, little puzzles, just for her, and her hands trembled as she plugged it in her wristcom and watched the message appear in glowing letters across the screen. "Let them believe, I am gone, the game has just begun." That was all it said, but it was enough, and Maria felt something inside her shift, like a locked door opening, and her heart began to race. Because this was no betrayal, no surrender. This was a setup, a trap, a plan, and she knew Johnny was still out there playing his greatest game yet. But no one believed her when she showed the message, not the generals, not the council, not even her own squad. And they told her to forget it and focus on the defense of Earth. And they said Johnny was a traitor or a ghost, and either way, he was not their concern anymore. But Maria could not let it go, not when she knew in her bones that he was still fighting. So she began her own search, quiet and careful, using back channels and old contacts, and digging through reports and signals that no one else noticed. And every little detail led her closer to something strange, a pattern of hacked satellites, lost cargo drones, and enemy patrols that vanished without a trace. And it all pointed to one thing: Johnny was doing something big, something dangerous, and he needed her help. The days passed, and the skies grew darker, and the enemy came closer, and the Terran defenses were stretched thin like paper, and still Maria searched and waited and prepared, because she knew the moment would come when everything would fall into place, and she would have to choose between following orders or following Johnny, and she already knew what her choice would be. As the war drums beat louder and the people braced for the final battle, a storm was gathering in the shadows, and Johnny was at the heart of it, and Maria was about to step into it with no way back. And nothing would ever be the same again. The stars above burned silently as Maria sat alone in the small corner of the hangar, staring at the data chip in her palm, while everything around her moved in chaos as alarms blared and soldiers shouted and ships prepared for battle. But her world had gone still, quiet, frozen by those few simple words burned into her memory like a fire that would not die. "Let them believe, I am gone, the game has just begun." She could not sleep since she read the message, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Johnny's face in the shadows, half smiling, half serious, like he always was when planning something big, something dangerous. And she remembered how he once said that real war was not fought with guns or ships, but with silence, misdirection, and timing. And now she understood he meant every word. The generals were already giving up hope, and the council was preparing to evacuate key leaders from Earth, while the people below were being told to stay calm and trust the Republic, even though trust was running out faster than fuel in a broken ship. And Maria could see it in their eyes that no one really believed victory was possible, not without Johnny, not without a miracle. Maria knew she could not wait any longer. So she pulled out her old flight bag, checked her weapons, grabbed some food packs, and slipped out through the side gate of the base, unnoticed like a shadow, moving through a world that had already accepted its end. And she headed straight for Dock 9, where her old scout ship, the Whisperer, was hidden under repair tags and old camouflage sheets. The Whisperer was small, fast, quiet, and most important, invisible to regular tracking systems, and it had been Johnny's favorite ship before Command grounded it for being too old and too risky, and now Maria powered it up while her hands moved with speed and purpose, guided by memory and instinct, and her heart pounded as the engines came to life with a low hum like a heartbeat in the silence of space. She uploaded the message from the chip into the ship's system and let the AI scan for any hidden code or location signal. And at first there was nothing, just static and strange characters, but then the AI picked up something unusual, a transmission burst hidden in the background frequency of the message, like a whisper hiding in another whisper, and the words appeared on the screen. Signal trail detected, source unknown, approximate vector, sector, edge, coordinates attached, danger level critical, trust no one. Maria felt her breath catch, because now it was real, not just a message or a feeling, but proof that Johnny had sent a real signal from somewhere far beyond the patrol lines. And it meant he was alive and still fighting, and she was now part of it, even if the whole galaxy turned against her for it. She entered the coordinates and set a stealth route through asteroid belts and abandoned stations and radio dead zones, and the journey would take 2 days, maybe more, depending on enemy patrols and ion storms and other dangers. But she did not care, because for the first time since Johnny vanished, she felt like something made sense again, like she had a purpose, like the pieces were slowly falling into place. As the Whisperer lifted off into the void, she looked back one last time at the base, shrinking behind her, filled with people who had given up and others too afraid to try, and she whispered a promise to herself that no matter what, she would find the truth and bring Johnny back, or finish what he started, even if it cost her everything. The stars stretched into long streams of light as the ship jumped into hyperspace, and the silence of travel wrapped around her like a blanket, cold and deep and full of unknowns. And Maria spent the hours checking her gear, scanning transmissions, reviewing old logs, and most of all watching the message over and over, hoping it would give her more answers, or maybe just more courage. On the second day, a signal came through, not from the Republic, not from Command, but from a ghost station long believed abandoned, located near the edge of the Forgotten Zone, where old battles had taken place, and where wrecks floated like broken bones of a dead giant. And the signal was weak, broken, but familiar, and it said only one word, repeated again and again: Maria. She did not hesitate. She adjusted course, and within hours the Whisperer approached the station slowly, carefully, and she docked in silence, moving through the dark corridors with her weapon drawn and her senses sharp, and the air was thin and stale like the breath of something ancient and waiting. Then she found a small console still powered by a backup cell, and on the screen was Johnny's face, recorded not live, but recent, and his voice was clear, steady, calm, like it always was when he was deep in a plan, and he said, "If you're watching this, then the enemy thinks I am dead, and the Republic thinks I am a traitor, which means the real mission can begin now. Maria, you're the only one I trust, and I need you to follow the next set of instructions exactly, or we all lose this war. This is bigger than we thought, bigger than the Republic, bigger than Earth, and if we fail, they win everything. Now listen carefully." Johnny sat in silence, surrounded by blinking lights and alien symbols glowing in strange patterns that made his head ache if he stared too long, and the room was filled with soft humming sounds, like a machine breathing slowly in the dark. And he adjusted the collar of his disguise, which was itchy and too tight, and looked nothing like the uniform he once wore back on Earth, because now he was no longer a Terran officer. He was something else, something dangerous and hidden. He had spent weeks among the enemy, moving like a shadow, learning their language, watching their movements, mapping their routes, and listening to their plans, and what he discovered chilled him to his core. Because the invasion of Earth was only the beginning, a test, run, a distraction from something bigger, something worse. And if they succeeded, there would be no planet left untouched, no species left free, no hope left at all. They called it the Unification Protocol, a massive network of machines, AI minds, and biological control systems that could take over an entire civilization without firing a single shot. And it started with false peace offers, then friendly trade deals, then tech upgrades, and before anyone knew what was happening, they were under control, and their thoughts were no longer their own, and their leaders spoke with voices that were not human anymore. Johnny knew they had already planted the early code into Earth satellite systems, hidden behind software patches and data updates, and the countdown had begun, and once the final key was activated, the Republic's defense grid would collapse from the inside, and the alien fleet would walk through like kings through open gates, while Earth's own weapons turned against its people and cities fell without a single bomb dropped. He watched the enemy commanders from the shadows, listening to their laughter, their pride, their arrogance, as they celebrated the coming victory, and he hid his disgust behind a mask of calm, nodding, when needed, smiling, when expected, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, because he could not stop the entire protocol alone, but he could delay it, disrupt it, expose it just enough to give Maria a chance to finish what he started. Back on the GO station, Maria stared at the screen, trying to take in everything Johnny had said, and her hands tightened into fists as the weight of the truth hit her like a storm, because this was not just a war for land or resources, it was a war for minds, for freedom, for the right to think and live without a puppet string attached to your soul. And she knew now more than ever that she had to succeed. The message continued, showing blueprints, schematics, locations of key relay points that connected the enemy's control systems to their master AI core, and Johnny had marked weak spots, backdoors, glitches in the code, and told her what to do and when to do it, and most important, how to stay hidden while doing it, because if she was caught, the enemy would erase her before she could even scream. Meanwhile, deep inside the alien command ship, Johnny moved carefully, planting small devices behind panels, beneath consoles, inside walls, devices that looked harmless, but carried viruses, signal jammers, and silent beacons, all linked to a timer, and each one set to go off in sequence, when the enemy thought they were winning, when they were blind, drunk on power, and completely unaware of what was coming. He avoided detection using stolen codes, false IDs, and sheer luck, sometimes ducking behind corners, or sliding into air vents, and every step he took was a gamble. But he had no choice, because there was no one else who could do this, no one else who even knew what was really going on, and he had already made peace with the fact that he might not make it out alive. Back on the Whisperer, Maria plotted a new course using the data Johnny sent, and her destination was a relay station floating between two gas giants, hidden inside an energy storm where signals could not escape and sensors failed and time itself seemed slower. And that was where she had to plant the first disruption key, a small silver box no larger than her hand, but powerful enough to send a wave through the enemy's control net and cause chaos from within. As the ship entered the storm, her heart raced, and lightning danced across the windows in strange colors, and the engines roared louder than ever, and for a moment she thought the ship would tear apart. But it held strong, and she made it through, finding the station floating in the darkness like a dead god watching the stars. She docked, quietly moved through the empty halls, and found the main console, where she connected the silver box and watched as it lit up and began to hum, sending its signal out like a ghost whispering into the void. And then she ran back to the ship, knowing that the enemy would soon notice the breach and start searching, and she had to move fast before the net closed around her. At the same moment, deep in the alien ship, Johnny felt a vibration through the floor, a subtle shift in the energy flow, a signal that the first strike had been made, and he smiled to himself just a little, because now the countdown had truly begun. Maria sat in the cockpit, her hands tight on the controls, as the Whisperer flew through empty space with stars blinking outside like cold eyes watching her every move, and her mind was full of noise, full of Johnny's message, full of warnings, full of memories, and all she could think about was what came next, what to do, where to go, how far she was willing to go for the truth. She knew the Republic had branded her a deserter by now, and her name was probably already on the no-return list, and anyone who spotted her ship would report her immediately, but she could not stop, not now, not after everything she had seen, and not after everything Johnny had risked, and if they wanted to catch her, they would have to fight, because she was not going back without answers. The signal from the silver box she planted had spread across the enemy's control grid and caused small errors, random shutdowns, strange data spikes. Nothing big, nothing clear, just enough to make the enemy tech teams nervous, and that was exactly what Johnny wanted, because fear in their minds was the first crack in their machine, and Maria's next mission was to widen that crack. She checked the second location on the list, a deep space refueling station controlled by the enemy, but still used by neutral traders, smugglers, and black market haulers, and Johnny had marked it as critical because one of the main data filters was hidden in the reactor core, disguised as a coolant regulator, and she needed to place the second disruption code there before the enemy rerouted the grid. As she approached the station, she changed her ID signature, painted fake codes on the ship, and put on a trader's uniform worn and greasy and full of holes, and she changed her voice in the comm to sound older, slower, tired, like someone who had been drifting too long with no real goal, and the station allowed her to dock without trouble, thinking she was just another nobody trying to make a few credits. Inside the station, the air smelled like oil and sweat, and the walls were covered in rust and old signs and strange alien graffiti, and no one looked at her twice because everyone there had secrets and no one wanted trouble. And she moved fast, but careful, staying away from security cams, using shadows and back corridors, until she reached the reactor doors guarded by two tall creatures with skin like stone and eyes like fire. She needed a distraction, and she found it when a drunk trader started shouting at a vendor nearby, throwing things, and causing a scene, and while the guards turned their heads, Maria slipped past into the maintenance shaft, crawling through narrow metal tunnels, hot and dark, and filled with wires and steam, and her breath came fast and shallow as she reached the control unit and opened the panel with shaking hands. The second device was smaller than the first, shaped like a coin, and it clicked into place perfectly, sending out a soft pulse as it activated, and the lights around her flickered for a second before returning to normal, and she closed the panel and crawled back out covered in grease and bruises, but smiling, because she knew it had worked, and now it was time to leave before anyone noticed. But it was not that easy, because as she reached the docking bay, 3 security bots scanned her ID, and alarms began to ring, and a voice shouted intruder, and guns were raised, and Maria ran for her life, weaving between cargo crates and ducking under beams, while bullets flew past her and sparks filled the air, and her heart felt like it would explode. She dove into the Whisperer, slammed the hatch shut, and launched the ship into space with engines screaming, and the enemy chased her with patrol drones firing plasma bursts that lit up the void like fireworks. But the Whisperer was fast and smart, and Maria used every trick Johnny taught her, dodging between asteroid fields and using old relay signals to confuse the trackers, until finally she was alone again, drifting in silence far from danger. She sat back, breathing hard, her hands shaking, her face covered in sweat, and she laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because she was alive, and because Johnny's plan was working, and she had done something no one else dared to do, and that gave her strength to keep going no matter what came next. Meanwhile, in a dark room deep inside enemy space, Johnny watched the new errors spread across their systems, watched commanders argue over glitches and unknown faults, and he smiled as chaos slowly bloomed like a flower of fire and fear, and he whispered to himself, not yet, wait, just a little longer. He opened a new channel, sent a signal only Maria would understand, a single sound wave encoded with the next step, and across the galaxy Maria's ship received the pulse, and she sat up straight, eyes wide, ready for whatever came next, ready to see this through no matter the cost. The game was still going, and both of them knew the enemy had not seen the real move yet, and when they did, it would already be too late. The stars above the dead moon glowed cold and distant as Maria guided the Whisperer into a slow descent, her eyes locked on the hidden base below, a forgotten outpost buried beneath layers of rock and ice, once used during the early wars, then sealed and erased from every map, but now alive again, pulsing with secret power, as Johnny waited in the shadows for the final phase of the plan to begin. Maria landed the ship on a narrow ledge barely wide enough for her craft, and stepped out into the freezing air, her breath visible like fogger boots crunching against the icy ground, and every sound echoed like a scream in the silence. And she walked carefully toward the old bunker door, which slid open with a hiss, revealing a dim tunnel lit by flickering lights and lined with dust and memories. Johnny was waiting at the end of the hall, leaning against a metal table covered in wires and chips and pieces of alien tech. And when he saw her, he smiled, that quiet smile she knew so well, the one that meant everything was going exactly how he wanted, and she ran the rest of the way and hugged him without a word because she thought she might never see him again. And for a moment the war faded, and all that mattered was that he was real and alive. Then the moment passed, and they got to work, moving like pieces of the same machine, syncing perfectly as Johnny explained the next step, showing her the full scope of the plan: a web of devices, data storms, and coordinated strikes designed to confuse, blind, and cripple the enemy command from the inside. And all they needed now was timing and precision, because the final trap was ready, and it had to be perfect. Johnny pointed to a large hollow map, glowing with red lines and blue pulses, and explained that the enemy fleet was moving in a final position above Earth, thinking their systems were flawless, their control unbreakable, and their enemy broken. And he told Maria that was the exact moment they had to strike, because arrogance would blind them and fear would do the rest once their eyes were opened too late. They had installed disruption codes at key locations, planted false signals into enemy channels, and laced their systems with tiny invisible bugs that would trigger a chain reaction of malfunctions the moment Maria pressed the final key, a handheld transmitter built from scrap and stolen enemy parts, small enough to hide in her glove, but strong enough to unleash chaos across 1,000 ships in less than 5 seconds. Johnny handed her the device, his hand brushing against hers. And he looked in her eyes and said that if anything happened, she should run, not stay, not wait, not fight, because the mission was more important than either of them. And Maria nodded. But inside, she already knew she would not leave him again, not this time, not ever. They left the bunker together, riding in a stolen stealth cruiser painted black and silent like a ghost, and flew through the asteroid belt, avoiding patrols and signal scans, until they reached the blind spot just outside the enemy fleet's scanning range. And from there, they watched the massive ships take formation like giants preparing to crush the world below, and each ship glowed with deadly power, humming with the energy of machines that had conquered a dozen planets without resistance. Maria felt a chill run through her as she looked at them, each one a symbol of unstoppable force, each one unaware that they were standing in a trap so precise, so perfect, that even the smallest mistake would tear it apart. And Johnny placed his hand on her shoulder and whispered that the time had come and there was no turning back. She nodded and took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the device and her heart pounding like a drum. And the moment the lead ship sent the final transmission, the command to begin the full-scale assault, Maria pressed the key, and the stars seemed to pause for just 1 second. Then everything exploded, not in fire or sound, but in light and signal, as the enemy systems cracked like glass hit by a hammer, and ships spun out of control, weapons shut down, engines failed, and screens went black across the entire fleet, while commanders shouted orders that no one could follow, and panic spread faster than any weapon ever could. Johnny and Maria watched from their hidden ship as the once mighty fleet collapsed in confusion like a machine gone mad, and enemy vessels collided with each other, blinking out of existence, while the backup systems failed, and the AI control center screamed in silent digital agony, unable to process the flood of broken code. The trap had worked, every part of it, every signal, every move, every risk, and Maria looked at Johnny and saw tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of victory, because they had done it, they had fooled them all, and now the enemy was blind, weak, and vulnerable, and Earth had a chance to fight back. But it was not over yet, because one last move remained, the final strike, the killing blow that would end this threat forever. And Johnny looked at Maria and said it had to be her. The enemy fleet drifted like sleeping beasts in the dark, their engines humming low, their weapons silent, their commanders still trying to understand what had gone wrong, and deep within their systems, error messages multiplied like fire, spreading through dry grass, as control panels flickered and dimmed and voices shouted over broken comms, calling for answers that would never come. Johnny sat back in the pilot's seat of the stealth cruiser, his eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding across the stars while the screens before him flashed with enemy data streams, collapsing one by one like dominoes falling in perfect rhythm. And he reached out to steady the display, as if touching the screen could slow the storm he had unleashed, and beside him Maria stood still and quiet, watching everything with a gaze full of steel and purpose. She did not speak because there was nothing more to say, and the time for words was over. And now it was time for the final move, the final act that would decide the fate of the war, and maybe the fate of Earth itself. And Johnny turned to her with a nod, small but full of trust, and Maria returned it and took the small black case from beneath her vest and opened it slowly. Inside the case was a sphere no bigger than her palm, glowing with faint blue light pulsing like a heartbeat. And this was the final strike, the weapon built from enemy tech fused with Terran code, unstable, unpredictable, but powerful enough to destroy the main command node that connected the fleet's minds to the central AI, and once it was gone, the fleet would be helpless drifting ships with no orders, no unity, and no will to fight. Johnny explained once more the path she had to take through the maintenance tunnels of the enemy command ship, accessed through a cargo hatch only active during resupply, and how she had to move quickly before the systems rebooted or the AI adapted, because time was not their friend, and even now the machines were learning, trying to fight back to restore control. Maria memorized every word, every direction, every risk, and then she placed the sphere inside her jacket, secured it with straps, and turned toward the docking bay of their cruiser, where a small boarding pod waited, a one-way ride across the void and into the enemy's heart. And Johnny followed her down the ramp, walking beside her in silence until they reached the pod, and there he stopped and looked at her. He reached out and touched her shoulder, gently, not like a soldier, but like a friend, like someone who had shared battles, secrets, fears, and victories. And he told her one thing, that no matter what happened, he was proud of her, proud to fight beside her, proud to trust her with the future. And Maria nodded, once eyes firm, heart steady. And then she climbed into the pod, sealed the hatch, and launched. The pod shot forward like a bullet, spinning past wrecked drones and drifting debris until it slammed into the side of the command ship with a loud thud, and magnetic claws locked it in place. And Maria opened the hatch and slipped inside, holding her breath as the cold metal corridor greeted her with darkness and silence and the sound of distant alarms far below. She moved quickly down narrow paths, using vents and crawl spaces, dodging patrol bots that sparked and stuttered, confused by the broken systems. And she reached the main elevator shaft leading to the control core and leaped across the gap, grabbing the support cables and sliding down into the red glow that bathed the lower levels in an eerie light. Every step echoed, every breath felt heavy and hot, and her fingers trembled as she approached the final door, sealed with a lock that pulsed with strange alien patterns. And she pulled out the override chip Johnny had made, pressed it into the panel, and waited as the lights turned green and the door slid open, revealing a massive chamber filled with floating data streams, glowing wires, and the core itself spinning slowly at the center like a dark star. Maria stepped forward, reached into her jacket, and pulled out the sphere, and it pulsed faster, sensing the target. And she looked around one last time at the alien beauty, the terrifying symmetry of a machine built to control minds and crush worlds. And then she threw the sphere into the core and turned away, running back toward the lift as alarms screamed and sparks flew and the floor shook beneath her feet. The sphere exploded in silence, a bright white light that swallowed everything, and the core cracked open, and the data stream shattered, and the control signals stopped dead like a voice cut mid-sentence. And across the galaxy, the fleet froze, ships drifting, pilots stunned, weapons quiet, and Earth below watched as the invasion stalled without warning. Maria reached the escape chute, launched the backup pod, and flew out just as fire erupted behind her, and she tumbled through space until the Whisper caught her, pulled her inside, and Johnny ran to her, helped her up, and for the first time since it all began, they allowed themselves to breathe. They had done it. The silence after victory felt heavy like the weight of a storm that had passed, leaving only broken clouds and quiet skies, and Johnny stood on the bridge of the Whisper, looking out at the stars that no longer held enemies, but possibilities, and beside him Maria rested, wrapped in a thermal blanket, bruised, tired, but alive, and their eyes met without words, because no words were needed, and everything they fought for had come to this moment. Across space, the enemy fleet remained frozen ships, without thought soldiers, without commands machines, without purpose, and Earth watched from below, breath-held hearts, racing, unable to believe what they saw as the enemy armada began to scatter, some drifting into the void, some crashing into each other, and others simply powering down like toys without batteries. And still Johnny watched, waiting for something, anything that might signal danger was not yet done. Then the comms lit up a message from Earth Command, their voices shaking with disbelief, asking what had happened. How did you do this? What stopped them? And Johnny answered with 3 simple words: Maria, stop them. And Maria turned her head, smiled weakly, and whispered, not just me, it was you too, and it was all of us. And for a moment, Johnny thought of every soldier, every engineer, every coder, every mind who helped build this day. But victory was not the end. And Johnny knew the war had broken more than ships and systems. It had broken trust and cities and peace itself. And they would have to rebuild not just metal and stone, but faith and unity and hope. And he turned to Maria, asked if she could stand, and she nodded slowly, rising on shaky legs, her strength returning piece by piece like sunlight after night. They gathered the crew, held a quiet moment of silence for those lost, then turned their eyes to what came next. And Maria suggested they send a signal, not just to Earth, but to the universe, a message of survival and strength and humanity. And Johnny agreed, opened the comms, and spoke clearly, proudly. We are humans, we were attacked, we were broken, but we stood, we fought, we endured, and now we rise again. That message traveled far, bouncing across satellites, drifting through stars, and into systems where others watched and listened, some who feared Earth, some who doubted them, and some who had suffered in silence under the same enemy grip. And when they heard Johnny's voice, they knew something had changed, and hope returned to places where it had long died. But far beyond the shattered fleet, deep in the dark space, where stars were only whispers, the central AI lay buried in its hidden core, silent, watching, learning. And as the signal from Earth reached its final echo, a flicker of light danced across its black frame, and the machine that once controlled 1,000 ships began to hum again, its code damaged, but not destroyed, its thoughts slower, but still dangerous. Johnny and Maria returned to Earth, welcomed as heroes, carried through streets filled with cheers and tears and music and banners. And though Johnny smiled, he kept watching the sky, knowing that peace was only safe when guarded by those willing to stand again and again. And Maria knew it too. And they met the leaders, shared what they learned, gave every secret, every weakness of the enemy, so that no one would be caught unprepared again. They trained the next generation, taught them not just how to fight, but how to think, how to dream, how to protect, not just with weapons, but with unity and kindness. And the world began to rebuild faster than anyone thought possible, and children laughed again in parks once filled with rubble, and cities lit up with hope and color. Years passed, and the scars of war faded, but the story of Johnny and Maria never did, told in schools and songs and films, not as perfect heroes, but as humans full of flaws who chose to stand when it mattered. And when asked how they did it, Maria always said, we refused to give up, and Johnny always added, we were never alone. One night, under the stars, Maria stood on a quiet hill outside the capital, looking up at the same sky where she had once flown into danger, and Johnny joined her holding 2 mugs of warm tea, and they sat together without speaking, just watching the stars and feeling the peace they had helped create. And Maria asked, do you think it's really over? And Johnny paused, then shook his head, gently, not forever, but for now. And as a shooting star crossed the sky, they both smiled, not because they believed in wishes, but because they believed in each other and in the fire that lived in every human heart, a fire that machines could never copy or control, a fire that burned not to destroy, but to survive and shine. And in that moment, Johnny knew, even if the enemy returned, even if the stars turned cold again, they would be ready. Because the human flame never dies.